still got a few more customers coming in, and I never like to see anybody turned down and on the opportunity to get a seat. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted you're all here. We certainly want to welcome you to the first of what is really a 4-day series of activities that celebrate the 75th birthday of journalism at Iowa State University. My name's Jack Shelley. On behalf of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, I've been asked to invite you to be with us for some of the other events that are connected with this happy occasion. And if our speaker will excuse me delaying his appearance for just a moment, I think I ought to sort of plug those things for a little while. Tomorrow evening, all journalism majors and faculty are urged to attend a party to be held at Thumbs Up. That's a local gathering place for intellectuals. Located at 113 Welch. The party is scheduled from 6 to 9 p.m. with what are described as, quote, free beverages and munchies. Party highlights will also include a blooper tape. Now, a blooper tape has on it various goofs which either got on various television shows by mistake or which were edited out before they hit the air. And it says here that one incident on the tape offers, quote, a chance to see Jim Zabel fall out of his chair, unquote. Now, many ISU fans might be willing to pay to see that one, but if you come tomorrow night, you won't have to pay. On Friday, a giant birthday cake is going to be assembled in the journalism reading room in the press building, and students and faculty and parents and alumni and friends are all invited to be on hand. We're going to frost the cake at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then at about 4 p.m., 75 candles, I'm told, will be lighted, and one and all will then sing Happy Birthday. Gobs of cake and punch are promised after this huge cake has been cut. 75 candles on a cake made up of many, many cakes in an unusual, interesting formation. On Saturday, starting at 10:45 in the morning, in the Sheeman Building, scores of alumni and friends will be on hand for a program and luncheon that will include, we're told, a big surprise that will affect every member of the journalism faculty. I don't think it's going to be a 20% pay increase, but I do know enough about it to be sure that we'll all be pleased about it, and I know many of you are anxious to hear what that'll be. Also a highlight of this climatic event for our 75th birthday celebration will be the presentation for only the third time of the James W. Schwartz Award for Distinguished Service in Journalism. It goes this year to a distinguished ISU journalism alumnus, Bob Bartley, who is editor and director of the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, as most of you know. And following Iowa State's anticipated victory over Kansas State in the football game, there'll be two sets of parties for alumni and friends, one group of parties from 4 to 7 p.m., the others from 8 to 11, in homes of various journalism faculty members. And if you'd like to attend any of these affairs, particularly those on Saturday at Sheeman or the later parties, please do check in at the Journalism Department office in the press building tomorrow or Friday, and you can make arrangements. We'd be very glad to have you there. And now we move to our speaker of the evening, for whose presence we are very grateful. He's James P. Jim Gannon, Vice President, Executive Editor of the Des Moines Register and Tribune. Now this means, among other things, that he's in charge of all news operations of the Morning Register, the Afternoon Tribune, and of the Sunday Register. Jim Gannon moved to Des Moines in May of 1978 after a career that covered 16 years with the Wall Street Journal. He started with the Journal in Chicago in 1961, covering agricultural and business stories in the Middle West. Then he moved to Washington in 1966, and he spent 3 years covering labor there. In 1969, Jim was made chief of the Journal's bureau in Pittsburgh, and he covered the steel industry and other business news from that point. Then he returned to Washington in 1972 as the Journal's White House correspondent, quite a job. He later served as the Journal's chief economic reporter and as a national political reporter, covering Congress and national politics. Jim Gannon is a native of Minneapolis. He's married to the former Joan Ring of Hopkins, Minnesota. We're happy to have her here tonight. And he graduated from Marquette University's College of Journalism in 1961. He and his wife live in Des Moines with their 6 children. And incidentally, if those 6 children all are as bright and sharp as the daughter I met this spring, they're remarkable kids, I think. And that is just a volunteer comment, Jim. I know you didn't require me to say that at all. Now, Jim Gannon's topic tonight is an interesting one. Muckrakers to moonshots, 75 years of journalism and beyond. Before he begins, I do want to point out that after the talk and after a rather brief question and answer session, we're going to have a reception. Now, the reception's in what is called the Gold Room, and those of you who know the Union will not have trouble finding it, but some of you may. The Gold Room is in that last and most recent edition that was put on the Union, the one that's out here to the east as you go out on the main floor and is between this general area and the parking ramp. So you just keep going east on the main floor, jog to the right, and jog again, and you'll find the Gold Room there, a very nice room where the reception will be held. So you're all invited to come to that reception after we have finished with the speaking and with the questions and answers this evening. So, let me remind you all again, you are invited to each and every one of these events of our 4-day celebration of 75 years of journalism at Iowa State University. And now it's my very great pleasure to present to you the executive editor of the Des Moines Register and Tribune, Jim Gannon. Jim?
Thank you, Jack. I felt it was quite an honor to be asked here to speak to you on the occasion of your 75th anniversary. That is, I felt that way at least until over dinner when I discovered that the real fun doesn't begin until tomorrow night. So, Jack, next year, if you'll reserve the honor for someone else and then just invite me to the parties, I'll be even more delighted. But it is good to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. And I'm impressed with the size of the crowd, and I conclude that many of your professors have assigned you to be here. And that doesn't dismay me in the least. I should begin perhaps immediately with an apology, in that some of you may have come here under the impression that I was going to speak on a topic about muckrakers to moonshots or something of the sort. Let me tell you a little bit about this speech-making business, which I have learned lately. What happens is something like this. About 6 months before an event, the program chairman calls you up and says, would you be willing to give a speech at our annual convention or annual banquet or whatever it is? And you say, well, of course I would, thinking that 6 months is a long way down the road and you probably won't live that long anyway, so you'll never have to give the speech. And then you promptly forget about it. And then about a month before the event, the fellow calls you back and he says, by the way, what is the title of the speech you are going to give? And I say, what speech? And he reminds me that I've agreed to speak at his event. And I admit, well, I haven't got the foggiest idea what my title is. And usually the fellow says, well, how does this sound? And then he comes at you with something like muckrakers to moonshots or whatever. And you say, that sounds just terrific. Yeah, that's wonderful. I'll speak about that. And then you forget about it until about 3 days before the event when your secretary reminds me, you are giving a speech at Iowa State or wherever about this subject. And you go into a cold sweat and a panic. And you decide, well, I haven't got anything to say about that topic, but they've invited me and they're expecting me, so I'll come anyway, and I'll talk about what I want to talk about. So for those of you who are here to hear about muckrakers or moonshots, my apologies. I will now proceed with other topics. Before I get down to business, I'm going to have a drink. There, now I can start. I suppose what I should accomplish in a speech on an occasion such as this is basically impossible. I would, if I could, provide you with a panoramic view of 75 years of American journalism and where it has taken us. I would give you, if I could, a definitive analysis of the history and the prospects for this profession that I'm in and that many of you will hope to be in. But I'm afraid that's too ambitious a task for tonight. Instead, I hope you will settle for some rambling musings about this business called journalism. This is certainly not any kind of a definitive work on where we've been or where we're going, but rather some reflections of one who has spent almost a quarter century preparing for and toiling in the vineyard of the American press. Let me go back to my own starting point. Like you, I started in a journalism school, specifically the Marquette University College of Journalism, with a rather general notion that I would like to work in the newspaper business. I tell you that partly to establish the fact that I don't have anything against journalism schools in general. I admit I have some misgivings about what I think journalism schools are doing, but I will get to that later in my talk. From journalism school, I went to work at the Wall Street Journal, as the introduction indicated. It was then that I discovered that my journalism education was only beginning. It was then that I discovered that many of the journalism courses I had really didn't mean very much, and that the courses that I hadn't taken, like economics and sociology and statistics, were the ones that I really needed, and I've been catching up ever since. Somehow or other, it all worked out happily. I spent nearly 17 years on the Journal, covering business and agriculture and labor and economic policy and politics and Congress and the presidency. Now that's an education. And it paid off in a way a couple of years ago when I came out to Iowa to be the executive editor of the Register and Tribune, from which position I run the news operations of those papers. So since then I've been getting a new education, an education in newspaper management and in the problems of the press and in the challenges of the future. And I'd like to explore just a bit, in a general way, some of those topics with you here tonight. Let me state this as my general thesis. The press in America today, and when I say press, I mean all forms of mass communication, including broadcasting, the press in America today has never been stronger or more influential. At the same time, however, the press has never been more threatened. At first glance, that may seem contradictory. And I will admit it is a paradox, but I believe it is one that reflects the cross-currents of a very complex society in which we live. It's true the press wields incredible influence and power in this society. Economic power, political power, opinion-shaping power. And yet it is threatened on many fronts. It is threatened economically, legally, politically, and technologically. All of these factors make this profession a very fast-changing one, where the future is very difficult to predict, and where the past is not necessarily a good guide to where we will be a decade or two from now. I'm not going to be able to tell you tonight just where we're heading, but I want to sketch out for you some of the forces that will be important in determining how American journalism will fare in the years ahead. First, though, let's take a quick look at where we are now. Many would say that the press is at the pinnacle of its power. Certainly, the experts in the field of politics will tell you that the press, and especially television, have taken over as the prime influence in America. It is by now almost a cliché to say that the news media have replaced the political parties as the most important force in national politics. The crumbling of the two major parties has been well documented. Party loyalty has declined, while political independence and political apathy have increased. This has created a vacuum in our national political system, which the press has moved in to fill. One expert, a fellow named James David Barber, who is a media watching professor at Duke University, has labeled the press as the new kingmaker, superseding the old political bosses and replacing the parties as the liaison between the electorate and the candidates. The power of television news coverage is particularly potent in politics. Theodore White, the author of those famous chronicles of presidential election years, has said this: television is the political process. It is the playing field of politics. Today, the action is in the studios, not in the back rooms. Almost any presidential candidate will tell you that the press can make or break a campaign. Some would go so far as to say that it is the media, not the electorate, who pick the president. But the power of the press is hardly confined to politics or government. The press has immense power to mold opinion on a wide variety of matters, ranging from morality to economics. Businessmen sometimes complain to me, as an editor, that the way we treat economic and business news often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the press says often enough that a recession is coming, consumer psychology will be depressed, and a recession will result. That's what they say. I think there's more to it than that, of course, but there is no denying that the press can contribute to an atmosphere that may worsen a recession or intensify inflation. All of this power, all of this influence, is increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. This is the age of the media conglomerate. The 3 television networks determine what most Americans know about the affairs of the world and the nation. But in this print business, a similar domination by Goliaths is growing. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the national news magazines, they all have immense influence in setting the agenda for the news business, and as a consequence, in determining what is important for our policymakers in government and other institutions. These media Goliaths influence the flow of news across the nation. Through their growing national wire services, the Times, the Post, the Los Angeles Times, and others are producing stories not only for their own publications, but for hundreds of others across the country. At the same time, these and other media conglomerates are buying up more newspapers and building vast chains of newspapers across the land. The Gannett Company, for instance, owns more than 80 newspapers. The Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Knight Ridder chain, and others have expanded into vast press empires. The strong independent daily is slowly disappearing. I consider myself extremely fortunate to be working for one of the outstanding non-chain newspapers in America. So it is clear that the press today has plenty of power. And it might seem to some that we are on top of the world, with nothing to worry about, except perhaps that our whole enterprise depends on a bunch of 11-year-old boys who can ruin us by failing to deliver papers in the morning. But I'll get to that later. The fact is, however, that we in the press have plenty to worry about, even if some genius does come up with a way to replace all those 11-year-old boys and girls. Despite our power and influence, or perhaps partly because of it, the press in America is threatened on several fronts today. I'd like to take just a brief look at each of these. The first threat is from the courts. After a period of steady expansion of press freedoms, the courts in the past few years have begun to reverse the trend. From the Supreme Court on down, the judicial branch is steadily chipping away at the scope of the First Amendment freedoms that serve as a bedrock for American journalism. For many years, up through the 1960s, the Supreme Court narrowed the scope of libel law in a way to make it very difficult for any public official or public figure to sue for libel. The definition of public figure was widened to include almost anyone from a rock music star to a school superintendent. But that's all changing now. The trend of recent decisions makes it easier for people to sue for libel and narrows the definition of public figures who have little recourse in libel law. The result is to make the press much more cautious on what it will report. The courts at the same time are expanding the scope of privacy legislation, privacy law, making newspapers and broadcasters more open to invasion of privacy suits. This, too, has had a chilling effect on what the journalist will report. More alarmingly, the courts have opened the doors of the newsroom to the police, and they have closed the doors of some courts to the reporter. In one celebrated case involving the student newspaper at Stanford University, the Supreme Court gave the green light to police to raid and search newsrooms unannounced. That is, to rummage through desks and files in search of evidence, even when no one at that particular publication is suspected of any crime. While inviting the cops into the newsroom, the courts have recently held that some legal proceedings, notably pretrial hearings, can be closed to the press. It is a sign of the times that a recent session of the American Society of Newspaper Editors was entitled, "What to Do Until the Lawyer Arrives." The moderator of that session was Charles Bailey, the editor of the Minneapolis Tribune, and he had this to say: "In the 5.5 years since I became editor of the Tribune, I sometimes have felt as if I were living in our lawyer's office, or he in mine. This is not just a subjective impression. You all know what has happened in recent years. The courts are taking picks on us. The police are taking picks on us. Other lawyers are. Courtroom doors are closing. Meeting room doors are closing. Subpoenas are flowing in over the transom. The context in which we work and live in our newsroom has changed dramatically and for the worse in recent years." As an editor, I can back up everything that Bailey says in that this context of our work in terms of its legal problems has increased dramatically. So all is not well on the legal front, nor is all well on the public opinion front. Despite its prestige and power, the press is not loved in America. And the signs indicate that the public attitude is perhaps growing less and less sympathetic. Listen to this from George Gallup, Jr., the well-known pollster. "It is clear from a recent survey of ours," Gallup says, "that the press in America is operating in an environment of public opinion that is increasingly indifferent and to some extent hostile to the cause of a free press in America. In brief, the survey shows Americans are leaning heavily, 2-to-1, to the view that the present curbs on the press are not strict enough rather than too strict." Gallup says, "The evidence is that Americans may be taking basic freedoms, including freedom of the press, for granted. And this is seen in the startling finding that as many as 3 Americans in 4 draw a blank when asked if they know what the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is or what it deals with." Here is a comment from another distinguished commentator on the press, Norman Isaacs, who was the former editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal and now is the chairman of the National News Council, which is a press watchdog organization. Isaacs says this: "I have been studying polling reports on the press for the past 25 years. There are times when public support of the press has run strongly. There have been dips. But one thing is clear. Up or down in these periodic spot checks, the long-range trend is clearly pitched against the press. It takes no genius to remark that down the road may lie a tipping point. What happens if disaffection goes beyond 50%? What if it moves, say, to 55% or 60%? Will American journalism be flexible enough to make intelligent adjustments so that it can honorably win back the support of rational citizens who can recognize that without a free press, there can be no free nation?" But there's the rub. How many rational citizens recognize that press freedom is not some special privilege for journalists, but a guarantee of freedom for everyone? We in the press have not done a good job in convincing Americans that they need a free press. Too often, journalists talk of First Amendment rights as if journalists own them exclusively. A free press is not a special privilege of those occupied in this profession. A free press is the underpinning of the liberty of all Americans, but that fact is not well understood or appreciated. The press cannot expect its freedoms to endure in a climate of hostile public opinion. This was clear to Alexander Hamilton back in 1788 when he wrote this in the Federalist Papers about a free press. "Its security, whatever fine declarations may be inserted in any constitution respecting it, must altogether depend on public opinion and on the general spirit of the people." So if the general spirit of the people toward the press today is less sympathetic than it should be, then that is a warning to journalists to look to their principles and to their ethics. If readers and viewers distrust us, it is because they have seen our failings and they doubt our commitment to correct them. To earn the public trust, we must be faithful to our basic code. We must redouble our efforts at accuracy and be willing to correct our mistakes openly and not begrudgingly. More important, we must satisfy the American sense of fair play, fairness and balance in news coverage that gives all sides a chance to tell their side of the story. We must guard against the temptation to play prosecutor, judge, and jury, a role that the press seems to have taken on lately in pursuing scandal in the wake of the Watergate affair. Yes, we must pursue scandal vigorously, but in doing so, we must remember that our job is to present and analyze the facts, not to bring indictments or render verdicts. Finally, we must allow a sense of compassion to enter into our handling of the news. This does not mean going soft on wrongdoing, but it does call for a sense of good taste and empathy for those caught up in the tragedy of the news. We must not let our readers conclude that we are above common human sympathy or totally insensitive to the privacy and dignity of people who find themselves pulled unexpectedly into the vortex of the day's news. Beyond these threats on the legal front and from a decline in public support, the American press faces extraordinary challenges economically and technologically. I suppose I could spend all evening talking about these, but I won't. Suffice it to say that we are coming into a new era, both in the economics and the technology of American journalism. On the economic front, we are now facing the era of limits in terms of resources. The American newspaper was built on the assumption of cheap and abundant newsprint, cheap and abundant gasoline for distribution, and cheap and abundant labor. From the underpaid reporter to that 11-year-old kid who's supposedly eager to make a few bucks delivering papers. All of those assumptions are invalid now. The price of newsprint has skyrocketed, and the supply has been so tight in the past year that newspapers have been cutting down on their own news space and even on their circulation to avoid running out of paper. You all know what's happened to the price of gasoline. That is a critical factor in the delivery of newspapers, and especially so for any newspaper that tries to sell beyond its own hometown, such as the Des Moines Register, a statewide paper, which delivers to subscribers from Davenport to Sioux City and from Dubuque to Council Bluffs. Reporters and editors, it's true, were once a low-paid species, but that's no longer true. The $20,000 a year reporter is commonplace, and the $50,000 a year reporter is not unheard of. I hasten to say that it's about time that professionals were paid as professionals in this field of journalism, not as if they were unskilled labor. But my approval of the development does not change the fact that it has fundamentally altered the economics of this business. Finally, ask any circulation manager about the supply of willing young boys and girls to deliver papers, and you are likely to see a grown man cry. There just aren't that many of them in most places, and where they are usually too affluent to be bothered with a job that earns them less than what their parents probably give them in allowances. All of this means that newspapers are under extraordinary economic pressures these days. The pressures are forcing the price of newsprint, the price of advertising and subscriptions up, and alienating some advertisers and readers. The trend lines, I'm afraid, point inevitably to fewer and fewer papers in the future. As far as technology is concerned, we are entering a third revolution. The first one was Gutenberg's, which started the whole thing. The second one has barely been digested in this business, the changeover to cold type and electronic systems to write and edit and compose the news. The third one is rushing toward us, electronic delivery of the news. This third revolution comes in a marriage of the computer, cable television, and electronic editing. We don't know yet what the offspring of this marriage are going to look like, but everybody in the newspaper business is studying the implications of sending news out over television cables or by satellite to receivers in homes. Most of the technology is available today. What's uncertain is the economic feasibility of this electronic delivery. Will people sit in front of their television sets and read news delivered to them from the Des Moines Register and Tribune computer? Will they pay for it? If so, how much? If they have 10 or 20 or 30 specialized cable television channels to choose among, some of them offering sports, news, consumer tips, classified advertising, hardcore pornography, or whatever, what will this do to their past reading habits and to their watching of commercial network television? Nobody knows the answers, but the answers will reshape the news and entertainment business in the next 2 decades. What we are going to see, I believe, is a fragmentation of the information and news business. You'll be able to pick and choose what you want and have it delivered instantaneously to your home. If you want only sports and weather and recipes and discount store ads, you'll be able to select that and skip all the rest. That sounds wonderful, but it obviously has some profound implications for a democracy that is supposed to be based on an informed electorate. Today's newspaper gives you a broad package: politics,